What's up, Liron here. We're in my living room and I thought I'd open this video in a bit of a different way. So as you can see here, there's a painting of the scene that you see behind there. Yesterday my girlfriend and her friends were studying, so this scene was quite busy. The three of them were sitting there with their laptops, with all of their notebooks and stuff like that, and they were studying, and immediately I recognized that this scene has a very interesting quality of light and shadow, and I wanted to paint it. And sorry if you can't see me really well, it's just because the light comes from there. But in any case, what I thought I'd do is put the painting back in the spot where I did it for the introduction, show it to you a bit from up close, and then we're gonna jump into the process of actually painting this. What I'm gonna do now is change the angle, show you the painting compared to the scene, which is empty right now, and talk a bit about the main characteristics that I saw, and then we'll get into the actual drawing and painting process. So let's begin. So here is once again the painting. I'm doing this handheld. Now I will just start pointing out a few interesting things about the scene here. So first off, we have the very strong sunlight from the outside. Then we've got all of this very interesting pattern of the windows, and then the table and the chairs and the people that were sitting there. Now, a few important notes for this scene in particular. These lines seem much darker than they actually are because they're so highly contrasted with the view and sunlight from the outside, okay? But in order to really convey depth in this scene, it was important for me again to keep them a little lighter and bring the real darks to the figures and the table itself and all the other details. So this may seem super dark compared to the background, but I edited it down so that you can see it's much lighter. Then I went ahead and placed in the table. Now something interesting happens here. As you can see, all of the chairs and stuff on the table reflect on the table. Same goes for this sitting place. It all reflects, and this is something I wanted to express here. So you see some reflections even on the floor, by the way, because of the strong sunlight. Reflections on the floor, reflections of the laptops on the tabletop. So there's a lot of interesting things going on here. In terms of the composition, I actually liked it that there are two figures here, one there, so it kind of makes it a little more interesting. This figure kind of closes off the left area, so that's a little darker. This figure, which is my girlfriend, I kept a little lighter because I didn't want them to compete and really enclose the scene too much, but it was important for me to get that curtain in here as well. So a lot of interesting things going on here. If you take a few steps back, I think this one really has some realistic qualities to it. It was done really fast. The process did take some time, but it was really a la prima. I just went ahead and did it, and I think you're gonna really enjoy it. So with that being said, let's get started with the actual process. Unfortunately, I wasn't talking while doing it because they were here studying, so I will record a narration after the fact, but I will still keep the video real time, so you'll get to see everything, okay? I may just cut out some very boring long parts where I do nothing. So let's get started. Okay, so let's get started with explaining the process. Once again, I apologize that this isn't narrated real time like my recent videos. Reason why is I filmed it spontaneously, and obviously they were studying and I didn't want to interrupt, which is why we're seeing it like this, but I will explain everything I'm doing. So with the drawing process, first off I drew a couple of perspective lines. This is the way I saw it. It's a bit different from in the photo. The reason why was that the height of my point of view was a little different from the one in which I took the picture. Now, my main thing with this stage of drawing is to be very loose. Most of the movement I do comes from my entire arm, from my shoulder, and not necessarily from my wrist or from my actual fingers. And notice how I'm barely lifting the pencil off the paper. What this does is, in some cases, it gives you this nice fluidity in motion, and I don't know, sorry, for my throat hurts a little, but I don't know if it's just me or just an illusion, but it feels to me like I can get the proportions to be a little more accurate when working that way, okay? So, regarding the composition, and I did talk about this a little bit, the way they sat down was perfect for me. Two figures, one next to another, then a third one a bit farther away, and that works really nicely. Now what you see me do is just putting in blobs. I call this the cloud method, in which I'm just sketching out clouds of the shape of the mess that I see. What this helps with is the same principle of loosening up. So the same thing kind of happens here. You loosen up and you get the proportions to be more accurate as long as your hand is trained to do it that way. Okay. And later on, once you get these clouds in, you can break them down into the more accurate shapes, into the more accurate different parts of the figures and the chair and the table and the windows and everything. Okay, now I want to apologize about the angle. This is the best angle in which the camera wasn't interrupting my work, so sorry about that. And one last thing, I want to reiterate that this video is real time. As you can see, I'm showing you the whole entire process, so it's not sped up. None of it is sped up. I did cut some parts where I mixed, and solely for the reason that you can't see my palette, unfortunately. So that's another thing I need to apologize for. So now I'm putting in that chair. Now, if you notice the scene, and I talked about it again in the introduction, there's really this nice reflection of everything on the floor. What causes this reflection is the strong sunlight coming from the outside, shining on, and then the floor is shiny and you get these nice reflections, and I'm already planning how I'm gonna place these reflections in from under the objects. And now it's time to make the composition of the windows clearer. This really worked out the way I wanted to. The windows and the way they were arranged, I didn't really need to change much. It looks good. And so I kept it the way I see it. Now I'm starting to develop the clouds into actual shapes. Okay, and I'm still very loose, still keeping my my hand moving all the time, connecting a lot of shapes, connecting some shadows, the legs of the table, the legs of the sitting area. I'm connecting everything as much as possible. And I love painting on top of these kinds of drawings. And the reason why is you just feel like you get to do more with the paint. And also I love these kinds of scenes that are against the light, like this one, which makes everything much more punchy and contrasty and beautiful. Straightening out some lines there, the lines of the table, and these elements, the mechanical elements, if you will, not mechanical, but the more, how should I call it, you know, the square parts and all sorts of that kind of stuff really needs to be loyal to the source in order to convey the real sense of the scene. Now I'm placing in the windows. The way I framed the scene, the windows go all around the top of the... What you see now is me putting in the frames of the windows on the top part as well. Above the window that you see, there's another windows at an angle. That's actually how our apartment is built. And what this causes is a bit of a different framing of the scene. So I'm not sure if this was the best way to do it, but it's a way that worked for me. Now, again, this is... Not again, but I just want to explain the perspective here. We actually have here 2 points perspective. So if you notice the sets of parallel lines on the table, they all, the line on the right and left recede to a vanishing point, imaginary point in the distance to the right. And the left, the lines that move from right to left generally move to an imaginary vanishing point on the left. The camera angle skews it, but in the introduction you saw this up front and you can tell, and also in the reference photo you can tell. It's a very gentle perspective, so it can be a bit of a challenge. It's not too striking, and you have to get it to look right, and that way you convey the realism that you want. So now I'm done with the drawing. It's time to paint, starting with this wash of mainly yellows and reds. Now this is important talking about, because a lot of people ask me, why do you choose yellow here? Why do you choose red there? The reason I mostly start with yellows is, especially in these kinds of scenes that I want to really convey as sunlight, is that yellow is a color that's very hard to preserve later on. So if I want to get rid of that yellow, it's going to be really easy for me. I'll just glaze over it with blue or with anything else and it will get lost. You can't bring it back. So if I'm going to put a blue here and I'm going to glaze a yellow on top of that, the yellow won't be visible. So I have to give myself this leg up and start with yellow. Same goes for red, only a little less, and blue is really dominant mostly. So if you start with blue and you layer on top of that a yellow or red, you can preserve some of the blueness of it, if that makes sense. Now notice how I'm starting to exploit some wet in wet. So I'm working on areas where I previously put yellow and going back with a bit of red. I also put some red on the right. This is to create some interest and variety in the initial wash or underpainting, if you will. Notice how many gaps also I'm leaving. This is a rough textured paper, and so it's really easy to get these spots on the paper, these speckles of light, and I love them, so I'm actually leaving a lot of them in. And I'm constantly coming back with, mostly I'm using here Nickel Azo Yellow and Alizarin Crimson Permanent, as you've seen me use many times. These are my main paints for this one, and then later on Phthalo Blue, because I need to get a bit dark, so French Ultramarine won't do as much. So this is the first wash. It's almost done. Did some wet and wet, filled in these areas. And again, my logic is this is a very strongly lit scene. I want there to be yellow, so I'm starting with the yellow. Okay, because if I won't start with the yellow, I wouldn't be able to bring it back. See what I mean? Now here is an up close of the scene, so showing you some of the small details, and now we're moving on to the second layer. Now, as I mentioned again in the intro, it was a very important segment. These lines that I'm working on right now aren't as dark as they seem. They seem a little dark because they're so close to the sunlight, the light source from behind, but they're in fact not that dark. And it's important to keep them not as dark. Why? Because I want to convey depth. And in order to convey depth, the objects that are closer to us need to be a little darker in this kind of scene. So I need to leave enough dark value to use on the figures, on the table, on even the shadows maybe. So I can't run out of dark values now. I must preserve some darkness. So I'm using a very wet wash, a little darker than the initial one, which was as light as I could, but still pretty wet, not dry at all. It may seem dry due to the paper's texture, and I'm just going for it, putting in the different elements, trying to connect everything. Okay, I'm trying not to let anything dry on me, so now I'm connecting this line to the top. It's still wet, it mixes, it flows nicely. I negative paint around the heads of the figures, around the laptops, on the desk, on the table, and I'm kind of working my way around all the elements that are more light, and you'll see me do that. I'm continuing with the light elements, leaving the dark ones to the end. Now, if you notice, there's a gap of light at the very top of the painting. This is questionable. I could have enclosed the scene with the topmost part and kind of block off that area. Everything that's above the windows I could darken completely. I don't know why I decided to stay loyal to how it looked like in the scene. I just felt like that was the right choice. Now, notice how I'm not too careful. I'm not too worried about messing things up. I'm holding really back on the brush. That's a risk, but I did feel very loose and free in this particular painting. It's been a while since I painted from real life, and especially outside on location. Now, this is inside, so it's not the same, but it's been a while. And what this leads me to is that once I finally do get the opportunity to do that, my vision is very sharp. And I feel like I can see things better, and especially with this kind of scene that I'm pretty trained at, of layering the darks alongside the lights at the back. I just felt the scene. And this is a perfect example of how, I talked about this in my podcast actually, about how what comes first is your vision. If you have an accurate vision of how you want to convey the scene, that should have priority, and only then the technique is meant to support that. So you can actually break a lot of rules when it comes to technique if you have a very clear vision of the result you want to achieve, which is really a paradox because you would think that technique is the thing that carries the painting all throughout it, but that's not true. So what you see me here is breaking a lot of my own rules, working more directly, more alla prima. The reason why I'm allowing myself to do that is because I have a very clear vision of what I want to achieve with the scene, which leads me to just do. And the technique becomes secondary. It also leads me to mess up some areas and make mistakes and have some inaccuracies. But that's just part and parcel of having a very accurate vision and playing that. And it was really important for me to give priority to the vision in that case. So now I'm starting to layer the darker washes. I'm going slightly darker than in the window panes. Not panes, the window frames. So here I'm going a little darker with the figures because I have to bring them more to the front. I am, however, making sure I preserve the highlights on some of the edges of the figures. Not all. I find that it can quickly become a gimmick, and I don't want it to be a gimmick. I actually want it to do it in a smart way, in a correct way. But I am connecting everything. So notice I'm moving onto the chair, and because I know I'll bring out the details later on with an additional darker wash. So I'm connecting everything. And again, not as accurate, kind of messed up on the legs of the chair right now, but that's fine, it works. Now I'm not going down with the right leg of the chair because I don't want it to get into the wet wash because it will then disperse too much. And I actually want a bit of a drier effect there. Okay, so now I'm finished with this figure. Moving along all of the figures, and I'm pretty much done. I can still do some wet in wet, add a bit of darkness to where it's necessary. But what I do want to add, and it's a bit hard to see in the reference, but there is a lot of shadow on the table, and then some reflections from the objects. Here it's a bit hard to see, but in the introduction I showed you how that works. So I'm trying to get that in, and I just picked up a bit of the paint there. I went a little too dark, which in an area that's not under the laptop. So now I'm gonna hopefully dry my brush and pick up some more of that paint. But in any case, you see me move from the right figure all the way to the left and covering everything up very meticulously, making sure that it's all one big wash, because that's what allows your paintings to breathe. If that makes sense. I know it's a bit wishy-washy, but that's how I feel at least. And that's what allows the viewer to read the scene in a calm manner. Because if your painting is just made of tons of individual shapes, it's going to be a big mess. The viewer's eye will have nowhere to rest. And here, when you connect everything together, and notice how direct I am with the brushwork. And I'm going to connect this second figure to the shadow underneath it and all sorts of things. It gives the viewer a smoother experience, okay? Which is exactly what I'm trying to accomplish here. What I could have done is maybe replace this with a thinner brush just to give me a little more accuracy. But it still works quite well, and I'm pleased with it. I'd rather have this bold brush strokes and stuff like that than to have a really light and weak thinner brush, or to lose the freshness of the wash because I used too small of a brush and it wasn't even because I wasn't fast enough, and so on. So yeah, now just closing off a few gaps here. We have also the laptop on the left that I'm going to put in later on. Right now I'm just worried with the shape of the table. It may look light, but the tabletop is actually darker than the light coming from the outside, which is why you see me going over it and darkening it. Now we move to the figure on the left, and this one was the most fun to work on for some reason in terms of the color harmony and just the values and everything, because notice how quickly I put in the blue for the jeans, and that's pretty much it. I don't think I'm going to touch that part at all until the very end of this painting process, which is pretty cool. You have to admit, it's like one go and bam, it's done. Now I'm connecting the side of the table here,
again, with these kinds of scenes, you must connect as much as possible. You could experiment with not connecting. You could experiment with doing things differently. It's, again, I'm not going to dictate what you should or shouldn't do. But from my perspective, it's really, really beneficial. I'm actually working on a huge scene right now. It's a commission work, and it's the size of a full sheet. So it's a full watercolor sheet. It's the largest piece I ever worked on, probably. I still haven't gotten to work on a full sheet. Just half a sheet was my largest. And this challenge of connecting the shapes is real. It is a challenge. It is hard sometimes. So now I'm going over the shadowy parts of the bench. Now, the table, this is something interesting. The tabletop is darker than the window outside, but I made the decision to leave the bench light. I will put some reflections for the figures on it, but it seemed to me like the right decision to leave it light. And that's very interesting. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense in terms of light and shadow, and because what basically happens is the bench is even more in the shadow than the tabletop. But for me, it seemed like the right decision, and I just went for it. And so this is the result of that. I'm going to add again the reflections. It's going to be a little darker, generally speaking. But for some reason, sometimes you change things around in the scene and you can't explain. I can't explain a lot about this process. All I can say is that I was so zoned in and so in the moment. Notice now how beautifully I put in some darker washes onto her hair. And notice how it flows so nicely into the already wet areas. It kind of melts in there. And then I'm going to add some smaller brush strokes in just a moment, and it just works so well. In the shadow, you don't see a lot of information. So having it all even when you work against the light is one of the biggest benefits and joys of watercolor painting, quite frankly. And as much as I love high contrast scenes, and this is also a high contrast scene, but as much as I love, directly lit scenes where you put in all the details and all the windows of the buildings, and especially if it's beautiful European buildings, as much as I love those, I love these kinds of scenes that force you to connect shadows. So now I'm putting in the hair, again, wet and wet, placed on the previous kind of red, lightly gray red wash I putting in the hair in there, everything wet and wet as much as possible in this stage. Putting in some shadows under the sweater or whatever it is. It's going to be all darker in just a few moments. It's going to be darker. I censored the background because it was a bit distracting, especially with the reference there. So hopefully you don't mind that. I think it actually makes the picture look better and jump at us a little more. So what else is interesting in here? Okay, so here I finished pretty much dry brushing her hair, but then I figured it all should be a little darker. And so I'm just adding a bit more paint, not a lot. And then I'm going to leave this hand a little lighter. It's going to continue later on as well. The reason why I felt it has to be darker is because the shadow under her is dark, but it's so much darker than the actual shirt that I didn't have the justification to do it that way. So I had to darken the shirt as well and everything, and then I'll have to come back to her hair and add it even darker because I need it to be darker than her shirt. So this is, again, you play around with it, you darken what's necessary, you lift what's too dark. There's a lot of things you can do with watercolor that will solve things that are a little too dark or a little too light. You can do a lot of things wet and wet. This is an aspect of painting I want to improve at, wet and wet, because it's something I barely practiced using properly. And I see all these artists that work beautifully. They combine wet on dry and wet in wet, and what happens is that there's this effect of focus. The entire background is done wet in wet. I don't know how they gain so much control over the medium. It's amazing. And the front is very sharp and crisp, and you can see this with a lot of Eastern artists. I saw a few Japanese and Chinese artists that work that way. Indian, not so much. The style I've seen that's common, and again, there's a lot of variations inside. Of course, not everyone has the same style, but even just the tools you use encourage you to have similar styles, like the calligraphy brushes that are very common in India. They encourage you to create a certain way with a certain looseness. So there are a few patterns that stem directly from the tools that are more accessible in different places. And of course, then you get your personal choice of, do you want to stick to that style or do you want to change things around? You're not bound by where you live in order to have your own style. So now I'm going back over this chair that I mentioned. There's a reason I went on this side tangent and I just forgot about it. But in any case, I'll go back to it later on. So this is the chair. It may seem a little awkward due to the perspective of the photography, but don't worry, it gets better. So now we're about halfway through, and these are mostly finishing touches, details. I'm gonna do some things that will better express the perspective. So now if you look at the screen of the laptop on the rightmost laptop, you'll see that there are a few highlights on it that are reflected directly from the window frame, which is why I left that highlight at the top. Now I'm trying to figure out, it should be much lighter, so notice what I'm doing now. I'm wetting the brush, wiping it on the towel, and lifting back. Okay, and here you see me lift. Oh, I wanted to say, so there are a lot of things in watercolor painting that compensate for its lack of opaqueness. So in oil painting, you can rework a lot of things. It has its own rules. You can work a bit wet and wet. You can let things dry. But overall, you can go opaque, and it's even recommended to start with the darks in some cases, establish those, figure out your range of values, and then come back with lighter touches. And there are a lot of advantages to this kind of way of working. It makes sure you don't blow up your highlights too much because you actually add the white. And in watercolor, you paint around the white or around the highlights. So you can leave a bit of safe space around them, but then end up having them too blown up, too light. So oil has a lot of advantages in that regard, but there are a lot of things you can do in painting that compensate for the transparency of the pigment. Okay, and one of those things is the ability to lift back some of the paint, to dab it with a tissue if necessary, and of course darkening is not a problem, a lot of wet and wet. So just wanted to mention that. Now if you notice, because I do want to give you a window to my mind and thought, if you notice on the very left, to the left of the figure, there's a line in the wall that I actually, in the curtains that I haven't finished working on. I haven't connected it to the bottom. And notice how annoying it is visually that they don't connect. I don't know if it's just me, but to me it's annoying to just look at it. So in a few moments I will close off that gap once I realize it's there. But for now I'm dealing with the laptops, finished with one laptop, did a lot of lifting, then wet and wet, then reworked it until it looked nice to me. Now I'm working on that second laptop. My main concern with this one is to leave a gap around the figure in the middle. So this is what I have to watch out for. And here you see I left a bit of a gap, a bit of a highlight, and it looks much better. Now I think I'm gonna lift a bit of that because it's a bit too dark. And in the same opportunity, I'm putting in some details. There's a mug, there are some notebooks there, a pen, paper. I'm gonna put a straw in it maybe. By the way, I love how I put the pen on the right there on the figure. That works really well. So yeah, and I'm sorry that you can't see my mixes. I should have maybe placed another camera in front of me, which would have allowed you to see it, but I haven't thought about it at the time. So now I'm adding some darks to the figure here, and you can see how my process is really all over the place. I'm going to darken her hair as well. But you can see how my process is all over the place. And why is that? Why am I kind of going crazy and moving all around the painting? It's because it is a very rare occasion captured on camera in which I'm completely led by my vision. Make no mistake here, I'm completely led by my vision. I know what I want to convey and I just go for that, which is why it looks a little different than usual. I'm a little less calculated. You can see I'm just working freely here. I wanted to add the floor, add some indication of the perspective. I just went for it. I didn't think about it too much. There's a gap there that I thought needs to be closed off. And I don't want to toot my own horn, is that the way to say it? But when I look at a lot of Sargent's works in watercolor, I can recognize he had a very similar quality to his work, that, like this particular one. Not like all of my works, obviously, not like most of my works, but in particular, he had this directness with the medium that was so beautiful. The way he put things just as he sees them, as he feels they're necessary, as he visualizes them, as he reads them in the scene. It always fascinated me, which is why I love his approach in watercolors. I think he's really the only one of at least the older masters, or well, he's not really considered an old master, I think, but of, let's say, not contemporary artists. He's one of the only ones that I see that has this quality. One artist that really has that quality is Alvaro Castanet. He really has that directness to it, which is something that I love a lot and I would like to apply to my own style. So my style is very different from Alvaro, but this is something I'd like to apply for my own style. Now notice again, I'm darkening the hair, as I mentioned. It has to be darker because the shirt is darker. So in any case, yeah, those are some of my thoughts around why this process is all over the place. And it is all over the place in some ways because I'm being completely led by my vision. And here you can see the scene so far. Very pleased with it. Here it's a bit yellow in this photography because of the direction of the light. By the way, sorry, I moved a bit and it seems like the recording was a little weaker. So sorry if the sound isn't as well balanced as it should be. I'm going to try to keep my head in the same position. But in any case, I'm completely led by my vision, which made this process exponentially more fun than other processes. And whenever I paint, I'm completely zoned out. I'm in the process. I don't think of anything else. I'm not worried about anything else. But with this, it was compounded even more. And it's just one of those rare occasions where you're completely one with the medium. And you can mess quite a lot of things up because of that. But for the most part, I think it's very beneficial. Now, I'm trying to put some very gentle details in his jeans, but nothing more than that. Just a few folds there were necessary there. Nothing more than that, really. And now, another thing I want to do, and I'm going to work on it a bit in a few moments, is first the chair. Now, there's a dark spot on top next to a highlight. I'll try and get that in a moment. But also notice how there isn't really a clear enough boundary, in my opinion, on the right side of the scene, so I will need to darken the curtain at the background a little bit just to frame it up. I'm gonna go through a segment in the painting process in which I only add dry brush and small little effects where necessary. Right now I'm still working on the main shapes, and quite frankly, if I'd been more experienced, I would have gotten them in the first go, and I wouldn't have needed to go over them again and again and again. It's just a lack of experience that requires me to go, like for example, the bench, that wooden piece under it at its base, it needs further darkening. Should have gotten it the first time. But when you have work to do on your technique, you may need to go and revisit areas. You surely will need to go and revisit areas you already worked on. There's no escaping it, but that's how you learn. And I've been thinking a lot about this in the last 24 hours, specifically about improving in my direction and am I doing things right. Now here, this entire bottom part should have been darker, so I just went for it, darkened her pants. Now I'm putting, again, a bit of a darker adjustment for the shape of the hair, which I felt wasn't as good. And some of it goes over the face. The face is too large. That's the part where I really messed it up, but that's fine. I could maybe add a shadow there, which I didn't do, that will help kind of fix the shape, but in any case. Now there is a stronger reflection under the laptops, and I haven't even gotten to the laptop on the left, by the way. So that's another thing I'll have to work on. And finally, I close the gap on the left, the annoying gap that I told you about. It's time to close it. I was contemplating, by the way, if I should add some details in the windows, meaning of the outside, and I decided not to. I decided it wasn't necessary in this example, so I didn't do it. But I could have very well decided to go for it and do that. But I decided not to for now, because I think it would open up a can of worms, like they say. It would be too much. It would be too... it would compete with everything else in the painting. So these kinds of decisions you really have to be careful when you make. If you look at a reference photo on the window, almost on the rightmost part, you can recognize some parts there outside the window. But notice how, to answer that, I just put a bit of red in the initial wash and hoped that that would be enough. And it was enough. Before making such huge decisions of whether to put, just a shadow or a hint of something outside, you really have to think carefully, because it will influence the entire thing. And it could have been a mistake. Who knows? Maybe I should have put something there. Maybe if I put it very skillfully and very carefully, it wouldn't have competed with the rest of the painting. Who knows? So yeah. By the way, I forgot how tiring it can be to do these full-on narrations. Now the center figure came to see the actual painting process, so I'm explaining a bit of it. Hopefully, I'll continue. I'll continue working properly as I do that. So I'm kind of pointing at the things I'm doing and what areas I'm working on right now. And a lot of the work is really the mixing. So I'm trying to mix as much as until I can see in the palette how it's gonna happen in the paper. Okay, and it's a big challenge. So now I closed off a very small gap on the top of the laptop, which was important because there was a gap there. Not a gap, there wasn't a gap there. I closed it up. There was a bit of it was a line near the edge of the table that you just saw me put in there. I just saw that there is a better division between the table and the distance. So instead of darkening the whole thing up, I just added this bit of contour. Again, completely led by how I see things in the moment, and it may not be as accurate. I missed some details as well, like the middle figure's legs I will add, and feet, but on the left I'm not really sure. Now I'm really cleaning my brush from getting rid of most of the paint because I want to get some very gentle outline under the jeans to indicate the shadow there, but I don't want the brush to be too wet. This is something I addressed in a comment not a long time ago. When you have very wet a very wet mixture on the brush, it becomes much harder to control the paint, especially if you want to just put in a small slice of something. So you have to clean off some of the water, some of the paint off of the brush. And you see me do that quite a lot. If you pay attention to how I mix a lot of paint, but then you see me, again, reaching for the towel. Now, it's not really... this part in the painting process isn't really a good indication of that, because I'm now at the stage where I'm adding some dry brush details, but even in earlier stages, you'll constantly see me cleaning the brush on the towel, getting rid of some of the moisture, then coming back. Now I just sketched in a chair, there's a chair behind the table. So really pay attention when you're learning from these kinds of tutorials, and sorry about the ambulance noise from the outside, we're in the middle of the city. When you're learning from tutorials like that, make sure you observe everything you can, not just the paper, but also the brush, how it's handled, the paper towel, the way you get rid of some of the color, how paints are mixing in the palette, which I don't show you in this video, so sorry about that. You want to really observe everything, okay? Because that'll give you a holistic picture of how the painting process was executed. I felt like there is a bit more sense of details on the table, so I'm kind of trying to add some more notebooks and imaginary things. Maybe I should have left a stronger highlight on the right for the notebook. I could lift it up, but I decided not to. This is supposed to be his cell phone, which I put there, but then it was kind of isolated from all the rest, so I keep adding stuff, and now that doesn't work really, so I just connect it all. I figured this whole area should be darker, which is okay. This is how I see it mostly, so that's fine. Now, the rare occasion where you see my palette, but you don't see too much of the mixes, unfortunately. I could mix it in a way you'd see, but that will make the painting process so hard and the result wouldn't have been as good. So now this part should be a little darker. And notice how still the top of the bench is lighter than the tabletop, which is interesting. And that's the artistic freedom that you can embrace. Because, and now the line at the bottom that I told you I'll darken later on. I do have a bit of a sloppy brushwork in this one, I feel like, which led to some mistakes. Like, again, the legs of the table are showing through the bench. If I would have done them a little more accurately, it would have read better. So that's actually my bad. Now I'm adding in her legs, the middle finger, the middle figure's legs, which will really add a bit of a more, I guess, feeling of solidity to the scene, anchoring the figure. One thing that's missing is a strong shadow there in the middle that I don't remember if I get in on the floor. And the reason why is because there's a lot of things going on that casts a shadow. But maybe I was afraid I'm going to lose all of my highlights. So yeah. And it's funny because with these kinds of paintings, again, if you look at it now, it looks like a big mess. But I promise you, if you look at the final result, take a few steps away from your monitor or hold your phone a little further from your face, you will see how the painting has a realistic quality to it. It does capture the light in a good way. But it goes to show how even when you have a very accurate vision and you have somewhat a good level of competence with the technique, it is still the result still isn't perfect. Okay, even when you have mastery, because I do think I have mastery of the basic techniques. I can tell what the ratio of paint to water necessary. The thing I need to work more on is the vision, is the fundamentals, maybe composition, stuff like that. Even when you have all of the other things, the result still has a lot to improve in, which really goes to show you what goes into a high quality painting. When you look at paintings by really experienced artists that have reached a high level of competency in developing their vision as well, that's where it gets really interesting. That's where you see some really inspiring stuff. And all of the artists that I strive to be, I don't want to say but to reach their level have that. Like all of the main artists, every artist that I mentioned in that context has that. So now comes a really fun part, that's dry brushing, and it's like drawing basically. You just draw, and this is where you don't care as much about connecting shapes or stuff like that. It's more about creating a sense of depth and creating a sense of details. And all of these window frames and all of the window panes, all of those parts have a lot of small shadows under them, small shadows encapsulated in them. And in this part, I will attempt to bring that out, and hopefully with a positive result. As you can see here, sorry about that. As you can see, it starts to make things look a little sharper, a little better. I'm trying not to overdo it, and I think I really quit on this painting in the right timing. A lot of people mention they have problems with knowing when to stop. I almost never have that. I talked about it in another video in my podcast, I believe. I never have that problem. I do have a problem of sometimes knowing what to add, which is funny. But knowing when to stop isn't something that really challenges me. Now, here is what I talked about earlier. You really want to close off, or rather frame the scene to the right. It felt to me like it needs a strong closure, so I'm adding a bit of a stronger shadow under the curtain, and also the dry brushing on the curtain plays an important role there. So I feel like it needs a little darkening to really make that separation, and to close off the scene on the right. Because the scene is quite open on the left, which is good because that's what kind of leads us into it, because the perspective leads us into the paper from the left and to the right, hopefully. And then on the right, it's closed off nicely. Now, the bottom part is actually a more opaque glass, and it has some details on it, so I'm just putting that in. And notice how, I don't know, I just love the way that looks, the little frames on the opaque glass. It's not really frames, it's actually parts where it's transparent, but that makes them darker. So yeah, and now there's the corner of the room that I just wanted to emphasize a little. It's not really the corner of the room. The corner of the room is higher there, exactly. And just some final touches of in this stage, I'm not even looking at the details. I'm taking a few steps back, trying to squint my eyes and figure out what's missing. Is something missing that can make this better? And if I find that thing, I'm putting it in. And if I don't find that thing, I'm not doing anything. And the moment you know you can stop is when there's nothing that you can add to the painting that will improve it. If there's nothing that you see that can improve it, there's nothing to add. And for me, I'm very close to that moment. It's going to happen like really soon. But just a few more frames. Again, the top part here is something that maybe I should have just completely closed off with the darker wash. Maybe I shouldn't have left that area open. Perhaps I'll re-tackle this scene and try and figure out if that was the right choice or not. And now I'm just dabbing some of it out. And with that being said, we're done with the process. Here's the final result. Take a few steps back from the screen. I promise you there is a realistic quality to it. So hopefully you enjoyed this one. And now let's wrap up this video.
So there you go, here is the finished piece. Very happy with it, very pleased with how it turned out. Again, the scene is empty now, but hopefully that still gives you a nice idea as to how I approached it and how I did it. One more thing I wanted to note, and I said I'll bug you about this a few times. So the Sketching People book upcoming, gonna be out in about a month or two. Be sure to check that out. I will keep you updated on that for sure. Another thing I wanted to mention, so I'm not sure if this video will be out on Thursday or on Sunday, but what I plan on doing is this process, another process, and then it will be 6 full real-time processes that I posted. And so the video after that, which is going to be on next Tuesday, or this Tuesday, is going to be just us talking, recapping the last 2 weeks and talking about the direction for continuing with this trend, okay? So what I'm going to do now is remove the tape off of this one. Let's do that. So here we go, and I promise, and sometimes I forget, so you'll have to forgive me, but I promise to at least try and remember to remove the tape as much as I can. I probably, in the video of just talking face to face, I'll probably remove the tape off of any painting that I forgot to do that with. So here we go, clean edge on the left. Sorry about my lame camera work. I'm not used to doing this handheld. Plus I'm using both hands right now. Here we go, and one last line. Should have probably left the top one, but in any case. You get the point. Here is the final painting without the tape. Let me show it to you a little up close so you can see some of the details. Very pleased with this, like the gentle pencil or pen indication that I did here, all the reflected light. The colors work really well, I think. I love the blue here on the jeans. I tried giving every color its kind of moment of stardom, so you have pure yellow here, and the pure blue here. Tried a bit of pure red here, but didn't work out exactly as I wanted, but still a nice result. Lots of dry brush effect, a lot of these kinds of things. And this is it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget, if you still haven't, to subscribe. I post a lot of these full processes and plan on continuing doing so. Hit the bell button to receive notifications for new videos as they come out, so you can mark them for watch later or something like that. I really want to thank you for sticking around, for commenting, for liking the video, because that really helps spreading out the word and helping other people find it. I want to thank you once again, and I will see you again in another vid real soon.